The morning of February 27th, 1944. Humidity hung thick as diesel smoke over the Admiralty Islands, while the smell of salt water mixed with freshly cut jungle. 500 miles northwest of Australia, Colonel Hugh Casey stood in ankle-deep mud, studying maps with the kind of precision a man develops when his calculations mean the difference between victory and drowning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He was looking at something impossible. 12 proposed airstrip sites across 3,000 miles of jungle, swamp, and mountain. Each one requires bridges, roads, fuel depots, and fortifications. Each one needs to be operational within weeks, not months. Normal engineering doctrine called for 6 months minimum. MacArthur had given him 6 weeks. Around him, engineers from the 864th Aviation Battalion were already swinging machetes through kunai grass tall enough to hide a man. The rhythmic sound of axes biting into mahogany trees echoed across what would become, in 48 hours, a functional runway capable of handling B-25 bombers. 2,000 miles west in Manila, Japanese intelligence officer Commander Yoshio Nakamura sat reviewing American capabilities with the confidence of a man who understood mathematics. His assessment was clinical. American engineering capacity, inadequate for sustained jungle operations. Their heavy equipment, too cumbersome for rapid deployment. Timeline for establishing forward airfields. Minimum 4 to 6 months per installation. He filed the report with a notation in careful script. The Americans will advance slowly. Geography is our greatest ally. 72 hours later, that same officer would be reading intercepts describing American fighters operating from an airfield that, according to his calculations, should not exist for another 16 weeks. MacArthur's island-hopping campaign was bleeding the Japanese dry, but not through firepower, through speed. Every week his forces advanced, they leapfrogged Japanese strongpoints, bypassing fortified positions and cutting supply lines with surgical precision. But speed meant nothing without infrastructure. Tanks needed fuel, bombers needed runways, infantry needed roads through terrain so hostile it killed more men than bullets. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese were fighting an enemy they understood. American firepower, American numbers, American determination. What they had not prepared for was American engineering. The ability to materialize entire air bases from nothing, to throw bridges across rivers that should have taken months to span, to build supply networks through jungle so dense it swallowed entire battalions. Casey had learned something in New Guinea that changed how he saw warfare. The jungle wasn't the obstacle, time was. Every day MacArthur's advance stalled, waiting for infrastructure, was a day Japanese defenders could fortify, resupply, prepare. But if engineers could match the pace of infantry, if airfields could appear as fast as troops could capture ground, then logistics became an offense. It was heresy to traditional military thinking. Engineers were supposed to follow behind combat troops, building permanent installations after territory was secured. Casey proposed the opposite. Engineers leading the advance, constructing temporary but functional infrastructure so rapidly that the next objective could be hit before the enemy recovered from the last. Colonel John Niles, commanding the 1139th Engineer Combat Group in Europe, had proven the concept could work. His battalions had built 119 tactical bridges in 6 months, keeping Patton's armoured divisions rolling across France. But Europe had roads, Europe had bridges to repair. The Pacific had nothing but jungle, swamp, and Japanese soldiers determined to make every mile cost blood. Casey stood beside his operations map, tracing the route MacArthur planned from Australia to the Philippines, 3,000 miles of ocean, jungle, and mountains. Across that distance, his engineers would need to build not dozens but hundreds of structures, bridges across gorges 300 feet deep, airstrips on coral atolls where solid ground didn't exist. roads through swamps that swallowed bulldozers whole. The mathematics were staggering. A single airstrip required 30,000 cubic yards of fill. A tactical bridge used 200 tons of steel. A supply road needed gravel quarries, timber yards, and crusher operations running 24 hours daily. Multiply that across 50 island assaults, and the scale became almost incomprehensible. Private First Class Daniel Ward, a carpenter from Oregon, had enlisted expecting to dig foxholes. Instead, he found himself operating a bulldozer through jungle so thick he couldn't see 10 feet ahead, following compass bearings while Japanese snipers fired from trees he couldn't see. Behind him, a road materialized. Ahead, nothing but a green wall and the sound of distant artillery. His unit, the 841st Engineer Aviation Battalion, had landed at Cape Gloucester in January, wading through surf with their equipment still packed in shipping crates. By nightfall, they had a command post. By dawn, they had cleared 300 yards of jungle. By the end of the week, transport planes were landing on a strip that didn't exist on any Japanese intelligence map. The speed defied belief. At Hollandia in April 1944, MacArthur's forces secured the beachhead on a Monday. By Friday, engineers had 2 airstrips operational. By the following Monday, American fighters were intercepting Japanese bombers, 200 miles away. The Japanese defenders never had time to regroup, to dig in, to prepare. They were fighting an enemy that moved faster than their communication network could track. But the real genius wasn't speed alone. It was the system Casey had built. Forward engineer units carried prefabricated bridge components. Airborne engineers dropped with miniature equipment light enough to parachute but powerful enough to clear jungle. Aviation battalions included their own sawmills, steel shops, and concrete mixers. Every unit was self-contained, capable of independent operation without waiting for supply convoys. Technical Sergeant Robert Holloway, a bridge specialist from Tennessee, had helped design the system. Modular Bailey bridge sections that could be assembled by 20 men in 4 hours. Marston mat steel planking that turned mud into runways overnight. Pontoon bridges that floated entire tank battalions across rivers Japanese engineers said were impassable. The first time he saw his designs work under fire was at the Markham River in New Guinea. Australian infantry needed to cross a river 300 feet wide with current fast enough to sweep a man downstream in seconds. Traditional engineering doctrine called for a week minimum. Holloway's team had the bridge up in 18 hours, working through darkness with Japanese artillery bracketing their position. 40 tanks crossed that bridge before sunrise. By noon, those tanks were 30 miles inland, and the Japanese defensive line had collapsed, not because of firepower, but because the enemy assumed the river would delay the advance by a week, maybe 2. They had positioned their forces accordingly. When American armor appeared a day and a half ahead of schedule, it shattered their entire defensive strategy. This was the pattern across the Pacific. At Biak, engineers landed with the assault wave, bulldozers grinding through surf behind infantry. At Sansapor, they built 2 airfields in jungle so remote Japanese defenders didn't know American forces had landed until bombers started taking off overhead. At Morotai, they transformed malarial swamp into an airbase complex, supporting 4 fighter groups in 19 days. Commander Nakamura sat in his Tokyo office, reading reports that contradicted everything he knew about engineering. American airfields appearing in timeframes that violated basic construction schedules. Bridges spanning rivers in hours, not weeks. Supply roads penetrating terrain his own engineers had declared impassable. He drafted a revised assessment. American engineering capacity exceeded previous estimates. Recommend immediate strategic reassessment. His superior returned it the same day with a single sentence scrawled across the top. Impossible construction rates indicate intelligence failure, not engineering capability. Verify data. But the data was accurate. At Admiralty Islands, engineers had transformed Manus Harbour from empty lagoon to functional naval base in 6 weeks. At Finschhafen, they built 3 airstrips simultaneously while fighting off Japanese counterattacks. At Nadzab, Airborne engineers parachuted with miniature bulldozers and had a landing strip cleared before the infantry secured the perimeter. The machinery of American industry had followed MacArthur across the Pacific, bulldozers modified with armor plating, graders with protected cabs, dump trucks that could ford 4 feet of water. But more importantly, they brought expertise, welders who could fabricate bridge components in the field, heavy equipment operators who knew how to coax maximum power from overtaxed engines, foremen who could organize 1,000-man work crews speaking a dozen different languages. Sergeant James Yamaguchi, a Nisei engineer from California, worked as a translator and technical advisor. His unit included Filipino laborers, Australian sappers, and New Guinea natives who knew the jungle better than any map. Together, they formed construction crews that operated with efficiency Japanese planners couldn't match. At Buna, Yamaguchi's mixed crew built a corduroy road through swamp by laying logs perpendicular to the route, creating a floating surface that supported trucks carrying 5 tons of supplies. The technique was ancient. The execution was industrial. They laid 2 miles of road in 3 days, working knee-deep in water that bred malaria and dysentery. The diseases killed more men than combat. Ward contracted dengue fever at Cape Gloucester, spent a week delirious in a field hospital, then returned to his bulldozer still running fever because they needed every operator. Holloway caught malaria 3 separate times, treated it with quinine that made his ears ring, and kept working because bridges didn't build themselves. This was the hidden cost of MacArthur's advance. For every casualty reported in combat, 2 more fell to disease, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Engineers worked 18-hour shifts in 100-degree heat with humidity so high sweat never evaporated. They slept in mud, ate canned rations that never varied, and woke to do it again knowing one mistake could kill dozens. But they kept building. At Aitape, they carved an airfield from the jungle in 14 days. At WWII Island, they extended an existing Japanese runway, while artillery duels raged 300 yards away. At Noem4, they landed with 3 complete aviation battalions and had operational airstrips before the infantry finished securing the beach. The Japanese couldn't understand it. Their own engineering doctrine required secure rear areas, established supply lines, and careful planning. American engineers built under fire, improvised with whatever materials they found, and finished projects ahead of schedule. It violated every principle of military engineering they knew. Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, chief engineer for the 18th Army, studied captured American engineering manuals with growing alarm. The Americans had industrialized construction, prefabricated components, standardized designs, equipment designed for rapid deployment. His own forces still moved supplies by hand, built bridges with locally sourced timber, and required weeks for projects Americans completed in days. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He drafted a report for his commanding officer. American engineering represents a decisive strategic advantage. Current Japanese engineering capacity is insufficient to match Allied advance. Recommend immediate allocation of additional engineer battalions and modern equipment. The report was filed and forgotten. Japan lacked the resources, the equipment, and increasingly, the time. While Yamamoto wrote reports, Casey's engineers were already moving north, following MacArthur's advance toward the Philippines, with bridges, roads, and airfields blooming in their wake like steel flowers in hostile soil. Private Ward, delirious with his 3rd bout of malaria, kept working because stopping meant someone else would have to cover his shift. Sergeant Holloway, hands scarred from hot rivets and rope burns, taught bridge construction to new replacements because experienced engineers were too valuable to lose. Technical Sergeant Yamaguchi coordinated with native guides to find routes Japanese forces never knew existed, building roads through terrain the enemy thought impassable. They were building more than infrastructure. They were building victory. Every airfield meant bombers could strike farther. Every bridge meant armor could advance faster. Every supply road meant infantry didn't starve while waiting for resupply. The logistics network Casey created became the skeleton that supported MacArthur's entire campaign. By September 1944, American engineers had transformed the Southwest Pacific. From Australia to the Philippines, a web of airfields, harbours, and supply routes connected islands that had been isolated jungle 6 months earlier. Japanese forces found themselves bypassed, cut off, slowly starving as American bombers operated from bases that should not exist. Commander Nakamura sat in his office, reading the latest intelligence with something approaching despair. American airfields at Hollandia, Wakde, Biak, Noem 4, Sansapor, each one operational ahead of the predicted schedule, each one supporting operations that pushed the front another 100 miles north. He opened his notebook and wrote a final assessment. We calculated American industrial capacity. We estimated their engineering capability. We prepared for their firepower. But we never imagined they could move this fast. The mathematics of warfare have changed, and we are fighting with obsolete equations. 3,000 miles of ocean, jungle, and mountain. Across that distance, American engineers had built the road to victory, not with bullets, but with bridges, not through combat, but through construction. They had turned geography from Japan's greatest ally into America's most powerful weapon. The numbers told the story: dozens of airfields, hundreds of bridges, thousands of miles of road. But behind those numbers were men like Ward, Holloway, and Yamaguchi, men who built in heat that melted steel, through rain that turned earth to soup, under fire that made every decision potentially fatal. They built while sick, while scared, while exhausted beyond reason. They built because MacArthur's advance depended on it, because the war depended on it, because going home depended on finishing the job. And they built faster, better, and more efficiently than any military force in history. The Japanese had laughed at American logistics. They had mocked the idea of rapid advance through Pacific jungle. They had calculated that geography would slow MacArthur's campaign to a crawl, giving them time to fortify, to resupply, to prepare. But they had never met men like Hugh Casey, who saw obstacles as problems to be solved. They had never fought engineers who could build a bridge before traditional doctrine said the planning should start. They had never imagined an enemy that could make geography irrelevant through sheer, stubborn engineering excellence. MacArthur's advance didn't just surprise the Japanese. It redefined what modern warfare could achieve when firepower met American industrial might channeled through men determined to build the impossible. Part 2. Continuation. The real test came at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. MacArthur had promised to return to the Philippines, and the entire Pacific strategy hinged on establishing a foothold on Leyte Island before the monsoon season made amphibious operations impossible. The landing succeeded. What followed tested every lesson Casey's engineers had learned. Leyte was supposed to have dry season weather. Instead, torrential rains began 3 days after the landing and didn't stop for 6 weeks. The soil, volcanic ash mixed with clay, turned to soup under the downpour. Roads vanished. Airstrips became lakes. Supply dumps sank into mud, so deep trucks disappeared entirely. Colonel Casey stood in rain that fell like a warm curtain, watching bulldozers attempt to grade an airstrip that liquefied faster than they could work. Behind him, ammunition stacked 10 feet high was slowly sinking into muck. Ahead, MacArthur needed operational airfields within a week to support the push toward Manila. He turned to his operations officer, Captain Richard Morrison, a civil engineer from Chicago who had built highways through similar soil back home. "We can't fight the rain," Morrison said, water streaming off his helmet. "We have to work with it." The solution was Marston mat, steel planking designed to turn any flat surface into a runway. But Leyte didn't have flat surfaces. It had mud that swallowed anything placed on top. Morrison proposed something radical. Don't build up, build floating. Use the mud as a foundation, lay coconut logs as a raft, then place the steel matting on top. It sounded insane. It worked. Within 4 days, engineers had constructed what they called a floating airstrip, a runway that literally sat on top of the mud, distributing weight across coconut logs harvested from surrounding plantations. The first test pilot who landed on it reported the surface rippled under his wheels like water, but held. Within a week, fighters were operating from a runway that should have been impossible. Private Ward, now a sergeant after 18 months of continuous operations, supervised the coconut log harvest. Filipino civilians helped, felling palm trees and stripping them with machetes, while American engineers calculated load-bearing capacity by eye and experience. There were no engineering tables for building runways on floating logs. They invented the technique as they went. The Japanese watched from the hills above, unable to understand what they were seeing. Their own airfields, carefully constructed with proper drainage and foundations, had washed away in the rain. The Americans were operating from something that looked more like a dock than a runway, and somehow it worked. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, observing from a hidden position 2 miles away, lowered his binoculars and shook his head. He had spent 20 years studying military engineering. Nothing in his education explained how the Americans could violate basic principles and succeed anyway. He wrote in his field journal, "They do not fight by our rules. Perhaps that is why they are winning." But Leyte was just the beginning. The real engineering challenge came when MacArthur ordered the invasion of Luzon, the main Philippine island, in January 1945. The landing at Lingayen Gulf required establishing an entire logistics network from scratch, while supporting nearly 200,000 troops in active combat. Casey's plan was audacious. Rather than wait to secure rear areas before building forward installations, he proposed landing engineer battalions with the assault waves. They would begin construction immediately, building under fire if necessary, because every day without operational airfields and supply routes meant American forces fought blind and hungry. The 1350th Engineer Base Depot Group landed on January 9th with the first wave at Lingayen Gulf. By nightfall, they had established a temporary dock using pontoon sections. By the second day, they were unloading supplies directly from ships to trucks. By the end of the first week, they had turned a small fishing village into a logistics hub, processing 14,000 tons of supplies daily. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Sergeant Holloway's bridge unit landed 3 days later at San Fabian. Their mission was straightforward but terrifying. Build bridges across 8 major rivers between Lingayen Gulf and Manila, 120 miles to the south. Japanese forces had destroyed every bridge during their retreat, leaving craters 40 feet deep and waterways engineered to be impassable. The first bridge, across the Agno River, took 48 hours. The second, spanning the Pampanga, took 36. By the time they reached the Pasig River outside Manila, Holloway's crews were assembling Bailey bridges in 22 hours, working through darkness using blackout lanterns and memorized procedures. They worked under intermittent artillery fire. Japanese forces, retreating toward Manila, would shell bridge sites randomly, hoping to slow the American advance. Engineers learned to judge incoming rounds by sound, diving for cover when they heard the whistle, then climbing back onto the bridge structure before the dust settled. 3 men in Holloway's unit died, building the bridge at Cuyapo. A Japanese artillery round landed directly on the bridge deck, killing 2 instantly and wounding 5 others. The third man, Private First Class Michael Santos, a Filipino-American from California, drowned when the blast knocked him into the river, his tool belt dragging him down before anyone could reach him. They finished the bridge 6 hours later, not because Santos's death didn't matter, but because tanks were waiting to cross, infantry was advancing, and the war didn't pause for grief. Holloway said a prayer over the tools they recovered from the river, then ordered his remaining crew back to work. The Japanese defenders in Manila expected the American advance to slow outside the city. Rivers, destroyed bridges, and urban terrain should have given them weeks to fortify positions. Instead, American tanks appeared on the outskirts of Manila 19 days after the Lingayen landing, moving across bridges that Japanese intelligence said couldn't possibly exist yet. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, read the reports with growing frustration. His engineers estimated American bridge construction at 3 to 5 days per major span. Reality showed completion in under 2 days. His logistics officers calculated American supply capacity at 8,000 tons daily through Lingayen. Reality showed 14,000 tons. He called his chief of staff, Colonel Mitsuo Nakazawa, and asked a simple question. How are they doing this? Nakazawa had no answer. Their engineers work continuously, General. No shifts, no rest periods. They bring equipment we've never seen, use techniques we don't understand. It's as if they've industrialized warfare itself. Yamashita stood silent, looking at maps that showed American positions advancing faster than his forces could retreat. Finally, he said quietly, "Then we've already lost. Not the battle. You cannot defeat an enemy who builds faster than you can destroy." The battle for Manila lasted a month, house-to-house fighting that killed over 100,000 Filipino civilians and left the city in ruins. But even as infantry cleared buildings, engineers were already rebuilding. The Santa Cruz Bridge, destroyed by Japanese forces, was under reconstruction, while fighting continued 3 blocks away. Technical Sergeant Yamaguchi coordinated with Filipino civilians to salvage materials from destroyed buildings. Steel reinforcing bars became bridge components. Concrete rubble filled crater roads. Lumber from collapsed houses built temporary shelters. The boundary between combat zone and construction site blurred into a strange hybrid where engineers built under fire and infantry fought around construction equipment. Private Ward operated his bulldozer through Manila streets littered with rubble and bodies, clearing paths for tanks while Navy destroyers shelled Japanese positions overhead. He no longer thought about the strangeness of it, the surreal combination of construction and combat. It had become normal, the way war made everything normal eventually. By March, Manila's port was operational again. Engineers had cleared the harbour of scuttled ships, rebuilt damaged piers, and established cargo handling facilities processing 25,000 tons daily. It became the largest American supply base in the Southwest Pacific, feeding operations across the Philippines and supporting the planned invasion of Japan. The scale was staggering. In 6 months, American engineers in the Philippines had built or rebuilt over 60 airfields, constructed more than 300 bridges, and laid down 5,000 miles of road. The numbers represented millions of man-hours, thousands of tons of steel and concrete, and hundreds of lives lost to combat, disease, and accidents. But behind those statistics were individual moments of heroism and exhaustion. Sergeant Holloway, supervising his 47th bridge, construction, working despite malaria that made his hands shake. Private Ward, pushing his bulldozer through its 3rd transmission replacement, teaching new operators the techniques that kept machines running past their rated lifespan. Technical Sergeant Yamaguchi, translating between American officers and Filipino workers, building bridges between cultures as well as across rivers. Commander Nakamura received his final intelligence assessment in April 1945. American engineering capacity had exceeded even revised estimates. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific were isolated, not by military defeat but by infrastructure starvation. No fuel, no ammunition, no supplies, because American engineers had built a logistics network that Japan couldn't match or destroy. He wrote a final notation in his intelligence journal, dated April 15, 1945. "We prepared to fight American soldiers. We should have prepared to fight American industry. Their engineers won this war before their infantry fired a shot. Future military planners must understand. Modern warfare is won not by the strongest army, but by the fastest builders." 3 weeks later, as Soviet forces entered Berlin and the European war ended, Casey's engineers were already preparing for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan. They would need to build infrastructure for a 1,000,000-man army on hostile shores, constructing in weeks what would normally take years. The atomic bombs dropped in August made the invasion unnecessary, but the preparations revealed the true scale of American engineering capability. Casey's staff had planned to land with 70 engineer battalions, carrying enough prefabricated bridge components to span every river in southern Japan, enough mast and mat to build 50 airfields, enough heavy equipment to grade roads through mountain passes that didn't exist yet on any map. The Japanese High Command reviewed the invasion plans after surrender, obtained from American archives. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, examined the engineering logistics and reportedly said to his staff, "Even if we had repelled the landing forces, we could not have prevented the infrastructure. They would have built their way across our country, and we lacked the capacity to stop them." Private Ward mustered out in December 1945. Boarding a transport ship at Manila with a Purple Heart he didn't remember earning and malaria he'd carry the rest of his life. He stood at the rail, watching the Philippine coast recede, and tried to calculate how many miles of road he'd built. He lost count somewhere past 2,000. Sergeant Holloway returned to Tennessee, taking a job with the State Highway Department. He never spoke much about the war, but every bridge he designed afterward incorporated lessons learned under Japanese artillery fire. Speed of construction, adaptability of design, the understanding that perfect was the enemy of good enough. Technical Sergeant Yamaguchi went back to California, where he used his engineering knowledge to help rebuild Japanese-American communities destroyed by internment. He kept a photograph on his desk, a Bailey Bridge spanning the Pampanga River, erected in 36 hours by a crew of Americans, Filipinos, Australians, and New Guinea natives. The caption read simply, "Built under fire, February 1945. Colonel Casey became a general, eventually serving as chief of engineers for the entire U.S. Army. But he never forgot the lessons of the Pacific Campaign. Speed mattered, adaptability mattered. The ability to build under impossible conditions mattered more than perfection under ideal ones. He gave a speech at West Point in 1953, addressing engineering cadets who'd been children when the war ended. "We did not defeat Japan with superior firepower," he told them. "We defeated them with superior logistics. Every tank needs fuel. Every bomber needs a runway. Every soldier needs a supply road. The enemy can shoot at your infantry all day. But if you can build faster than they can destroy, you've already won." The audience, young men preparing for Korea or Cold War assignments, didn't fully understand. They would. In future wars, engineers would continue the tradition, building under fire, adapting to impossible conditions, turning logistics into offense. But the Pacific Campaign remained unique. Never before or since has military engineering operated at such scale and speed. From Australia to the Philippines, across 3,000 miles of ocean and jungle, American engineers built the infrastructure that let MacArthur make good on his promise. "I shall return," he'd said when forced to leave the Philippines in 1942. He did return, in October 1944, wading ashore at Leyte with newsreel cameras capturing the moment. What the cameras didn't show was the engineering battalion landing 10 minutes behind him, bulldozers grinding through surf to begin clearing an airstrip before MacArthur's boots dried. That was the secret. Not just returning, but bringing the capacity to stay. Not just landing, but building. Not just defeating the enemy army, but constructing the infrastructure that made defeat inevitable. The Japanese generals never expected American engineers to work miracles. They calculated construction times based on their own capabilities, their own doctrine, their own understanding of what was possible. They were fighting an enemy that didn't care about their calculations. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto survived the war, working for the American occupation forces as an engineering consultant. He helped rebuild bridges he'd destroyed, construct roads he'd defended against, and restore infrastructure his own engineers had deemed impossible to maintain. In 1952, he attended the dedication of a reconstructed bridge outside Manila. The original span, built by Holloway's unit in February 1945, had served 7 years before age and weather required replacement. The new bridge, built with modern equipment and peacetime schedules, took 4 months to construct. Yamamoto stood watching the ceremony and did the mathematics. The wartime bridge, built under fire with limited supplies and exhausted crews, had taken 36 hours. The peacetime replacement took 120 days. The difference wasn't capability. It was urgency. He wrote a final notation in his journal that evening. The Americans possessed no special genius. They simply refused to accept that certain things were impossible. When we said a bridge required 1 week, they built it in 2 days. When we declared terrain impassable, they built roads through it. They won not through superior planning, but through superior stubbornness. Perhaps that was the real lesson. Engineering excellence matters. Industrial capacity matters. But sometimes the decisive factor is simply refusing to quit. Building one more bridge, clearing one more road, grading one more airstrip, because the alternative is unthinkable. The statistics tell part of the story. Across the Pacific Campaign, American engineers constructed over 160 major airfields, built or rebuilt thousands of bridges, laid down tens of thousands of miles of road, and established ports, depots, and logistics networks that supported the largest amphibious campaign in history. But statistics miss the exhaustion, the disease, the casualties that never made headlines. Engineers died building bridges, clearing mines, operating equipment that failed catastrophically under impossible conditions. They died from malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and simple exhaustion. They died doing work that never earned medals, fighting battles that never made news. Yet their contribution was decisive. MacArthur's advance succeeded because engineers kept pace with infantry. Air power dominated because engineers built the runways. The Japanese starved because engineers constructed the supply network that kept American forces fed. In the end, the Pacific War was won by accountants and engineers as much as by soldiers and sailors. Someone had to calculate fuel consumption, plan supply routes, design bridges, and schedule construction. Someone had to turn strategic vision into concrete reality, literally and figuratively. Casey's engineers did that. They took MacArthur's island-hopping strategy and made it work by building the infrastructure that kept armies moving, aircraft flying, and supplies flowing. They industrialized warfare in a way the Japanese couldn't match, using American engineering knowledge and industrial capacity to overwhelm an enemy who fought by traditional rules. The Germans had feared American industrial might. The Japanese had mocked American logistics. Both learned the same lesson. You cannot defeat an enemy who builds faster than you destroy, who adapts faster than you react, who industrializes warfare itself. Private Ward lived to 93, dying quietly in an Oregon nursing home in 2013. His obituary mentioned his Purple Heart and service in the Pacific. It didn't mention the roads he built, the airfields he graded, or the countless hours operating a bulldozer through jungle and mud while sick, scared, and exhausted beyond measure. Sergeant Holloway passed in 1998. His funeral was attended by 3 former crew members and a highway department delegation. They dedicated a bridge in his honor, a small span over a Tennessee creek. The plaque mentioned his service but couldn't capture what he'd accomplished. 47 bridges built under fire, each one a small miracle of engineering and determination. Technical Sergeant Yamaguchi outlived them both, dying in 2015 at age 98. He left behind an archive of photographs, maps, and journals documenting the engineering campaign across the Pacific. His final entry, written weeks before his death, read simply, "We built impossible things because necessary things don't wait for permission." That might be the epitaph for the entire campaign. Necessary things don't wait. Bridges don't build themselves. Roads don't appear through good intentions. Airfields require someone to operate bulldozers through hostile fire, grade runways in monsoon rain, and work 18-hour shifts until exhaustion becomes normal. The Japanese generals laughed at American logistics, mocked the idea that infrastructure could determine victory, calculated that geography would slow MacArthur to a crawl. They were fighting the wrong war, using the wrong assumptions, preparing for the wrong enemy. They prepared to fight American soldiers. They should have prepared to fight American engineers. Men who could look at impossible terrain and see a future runway, who could calculate bridge loads in their sleep and weld steel under artillery fire. Who turned MacArthur's strategic vision into tactical reality, one bridge at a time. The war ended in August 1945, not with a final bridge or a last airfield, but with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the victory had been building for 3 years, constructed across 3,000 miles of ocean, one engineering project at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.